No
In a
hyperspace
world
signature
broken by
registered.
shadows,
No ship broke through the
one
atmosphere
hero
on
must
any
rise.
long-range scanner across the Christophsis blockade line. Yet something tore through the sky above the crystal spires that night, and when the light faded, a boy stood alone in a crater of scorched glass, breathing hard, orange chakra still crackling off his skin like static before a storm. The Clone Wars raged across 1,000 systems. The Republic bled credits and clone lives in equal measure, and the crystalline world of Christophsis had become one more contested foothold between Republic Blue and Separatist Crimson. Its surface, all sharp reflective spires and jagged glass planes, glittered under twin moons even as artillery scars marred the horizon. It was here, in the no-man's land between a Republic supply convoy and a retreating line of B-1 battle droids, that the dimensional tier opened without warning and spat out a single figure in an orange and black jumpsuit, whisker-marked cheeks streaked with blood, forehead protector cracked down the middle. Naruto Uzumaki did not know where he was. Moments ago, or what felt like moments, though the fracture in reality made even that uncertain, he had been locked in combat with a reanimated horror wearing a face he'd hoped never to see whole again, channeling Six Paths sage power through every coil of his chakra networked to hold a collapsing battlefield together. Then the world had folded in on itself, and now he knelt in a crater of molten glass, lungs burning, Kurama's presence a low simmering static at the edge of his mind instead of the steady warm growl he'd grown used to since the war's end. He pushed himself upright. The two moons above didn't match any sky he knew. The air smelled of ozone and hot metal, sharp and wrong. Twin banks of droid chassis, headless and sparking, littered the crater's rim. Mechanical soldiers unlike anything from his world, their photoreceptors dark, cut down by something before he'd even arrived. "Where the hell am I?" he muttered, and his own voice sounded strange to him, swallowed too fast by air that didn't carry sound the way it should. He reached inward, instinctively, for Kurama. Something's off, the fox rumbled, and even that felt distant, muffled, like listening through a wall. Asterisk, this isn't chakra around us, kid. It's something else. Something old. Asterisk. Naruto didn't have time to ask what that meant. A convoy of vehicles rounded the ridge above the crater, boxy, utilitarian troop transports, nothing like the summoning scroll storage seals or elemental forged war machines of his world, and disgorged a squad of white-armored soldiers, rifles raised, moving with the drilled precision of men who'd done this 1,000 times before. Behind them came someone different, a figure in simple robes, a curved hilt at her belt instead of a rifle, moving with a controlled economy that Naruto recognized instantly, bone deep, as the walk of someone who fought. "Identify yourself," barked the lead trooper, weapon-trained centermass. Naruto raised his hand slowly, chakra still humming faint and unstable beneath his skin, senses screaming that this wasn't a fight he understood yet, and in a life defined by knowing exactly when not to throw the first punch, that mattered more than any jutsu he knew. "Name's Naruto," he said, forcing an easy grin despite the ache in every muscle. "And, good question. I have no idea where here is." The Jedi Padawan, young, dark-haired, watchful in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of Sasuke in the old days, took a slow step forward, one hand hovering near her weapon's hilt, but not drawing it. She was staring at him the way Kakashi used to stare at something with a sealed jutsu inside it. Professional interest layered over real caution. "You're not reading like anything in our databases," she said. "Not battle droid. Not organic signature I recognize either. What are you?" "I get that a lot," Naruto said, and meant it more than she could know. Asterisk, if you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. Asterisk. The troopers didn't lower their weapons, but they didn't fire either, and Naruto counted that as the first small victory in a night that had already asked too much of him. The Padawan introduced herself as Ashoka Rai, a name Naruto didn't recognize from anywhere and had no context to place, and explained, carefully, testing his reactions with every sentence, that Christophsis was a battleground in a war between the Galactic Republic and something called the Separatist Alliance. Words like Force and Jedi Order and Clone Army meant nothing to him, and yet everything about the way she spoke them, reverent and wary in equal measure, told him they mattered enormously here. He didn't lie to her. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, over and over, back when secrets nearly broke everything he loved. He told her his name, told her he wasn't from anywhere she'd find on a star chart, told her he'd been in the middle of a fight and then he wasn't, and now he was here instead. He left out the specifics, Kurama, the war, the friends bleeding out under a false moon, because some wounds needed time before they could be spoken aloud to strangers, however kind their eyes. Ashoka studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted from suspicion towards something more complicated. "You're not lying," she said slowly. "But you're not telling me everything either." "Fair," Naruto admitted. "You're not telling me everything either. That's fine. We just met." That earned him the ghost of a smile before she caught herself and smoothed her expression back into Jedi neutrality, a mask Naruto recognized instantly, because he'd spent years learning to see past exactly that kind of careful blankness in people who'd been taught that showing too much was dangerous. The clone troopers escorted him toward the transport, weapons lowered now but not stowed, and Naruto took in every detail he could as they moved. The uniform white armor stamped with individual markings and small personal touches, a painted symbol here, a strip of color there, that told him these weren't identical drones despite their identical faces. Real people, he realized, with real personalities pressed into the margins of enforced sameness. He filed that away. It mattered. It always mattered. The crystalline spires of Christophsis rose around them as they drove, refracting the twin moons into 1,000 shattered rainbows across the war-torn ground, beautiful and horrifying in the same breath, beauty built on top of a battlefield, same as anywhere. Distant explosions lit the horizon in flashes of white and orange, and Naruto felt something old and familiar settle over his shoulders, the weight of a war he hadn't chosen, in a place he didn't understand, surrounded by people who didn't know yet whether to call him ally or enemy. "You've been here before," Kurama rumbled, chakra still thin and strange inside him but present, watching. Asterisk, different world. Same song. Asterisk. Yeah, Naruto thought back. Asterisk, I know how this one starts, at least. I just don't know how it ends yet. Asterisk. At the Republic outpost, a hastily constructed forward base bristling with anti-air batteries and comm arrays, Naruto was brought before an older Jedi, a man with tired eyes and the bearing of someone who'd fought too many wars to trust easy explanations. This one didn't ask his name first. He asked what Naruto was, in a tone that made clear the two questions weren't the same, and that the answer mattered more than any pleasantry. "I'm a shinobi," Naruto said, and watched the word land on blank, uncomprehending faces. "A ninja. Guess that doesn't mean anything here either." "No," the older Jedi admitted. "But whatever you are, you're radiating something the Force hasn't cataloged. That's either very interesting or very dangerous. Possibly both." Naruto thought of Kurama, thought of every village that had once looked at him exactly that way. Jinchuriki, monster, weapon, before he'd spent a lifetime proving he was something else entirely. "Story of my life," he said quietly, and for the first time since the crater, allowed himself to feel the full weight of how far from home he truly was. Somewhere beyond the outpost's walls, in the tactical nerve center of a separatist command ship in high orbit, a hooded figure watched sensor readings of an energy signature unlike anything in the wars for years of cataloged phenomena, and allowed himself a slow, considering smile. The debate began within hours, relayed by encrypted holotransmission from the Christophsis outpost to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, and it would not end quickly. Master Ivus Kor, the tired-eyed Jedi who'd first questioned Naruto, stood before the assembled council chamber in hologram form, his flickering blue image reporting facts that resisted easy categorization. An anomalous life form, humanoid, possessing an energy signature the Force sensitivity scanners couldn't parse into any known template. Not Sith. Not conventional Force-sensitive. Something adjacent, something layered, as though two separate energies were folded together beneath his skin, and neither quite matched anything in the archives. He calls it chakra, core reported. A blend of what he describes as physical and spiritual energy. It doesn't correlate with midi-chlorian counts in any pattern we recognize. Around the holographic council table, robed figures exchanged glances that carried decades of unspoken history. Master Windu's frown deepened, arms crossed, a man who had learned through hard experience that anomalies rarely arrived without cost. Master Yoda's ears drooped slightly, considering, his jimmer stick tapping once against the floor in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. A being with power we cannot measure, Windu said. In the middle of a war we are already struggling to win. This is not coincidence I am comfortable with. Fear the unknown. We should not, Yoda countered, though his tone carried its own caution beneath the words. But wisdom, blind trust is not either. Speak with him ourselves. We should. See what the Force shows us of his heart. The council reached its decision by consensus, however uneasy. Naruto would be brought to Coruscant, not as prisoner, but not entirely as guest either, a distinction that meant almost nothing in practice and everything in principle. Ashoka Rai, whose initial report had first flagged the anomaly, was assigned to accompany him, ostensibly as liaison, genuinely as the closest thing to trust the situation currently allowed. Naruto felt the shift the moment he boarded the transport ship bound for the Republic capital, the careful distance clone troopers kept from him, the way conversations quieted when he entered a room, the particular flavor of suspicion he'd spent half his childhood learning to recognize and, eventually, learning to survive. They think I'm dangerous, he said to Ashoka as Coruscant's endless cityscape sprawled into view below the ship's viewport, towers stacked upon towers, a horizon without a single visible patch of open ground, more vast and more crowded than anything Naruto had ever imagined a settlement could be. You might be dangerous, Ashoka said, not unkindly. That's not the same as them thinking you're evil. There's a difference. There is, Naruto agreed. Doesn't always feel like it though. Not when people are looking at you like you're a kunai that might go off. Ashoka glanced at him sideways, clearly filing away the unfamiliar word, and something in her expression softened fractionally. You've been here before. Somewhere. With your own people. Yeah, Naruto said, and didn't elaborate, watching the city lights blur past below. Long story. Ends better than it starts, though. Most of my stories do, eventually. The Jedi Temple rose from Coruscant's skyline like a mountain built by hands too patient for the rest of the city's frantic verticality. 5 spires crowning a structure ancient and deliberate, radiating a stillness Naruto could feel even before he set foot inside. He'd trained under sages, walked among the spirits of long-dead shinobi, felt the weight of 6 paths power settle into his chakra network, but this was different. This felt less like power and more like listening, an entire building built around the discipline of quiet. He was brought before the full council in person this time, 12 robed figures arranged in a circle that made him feel, uncomfortably, like he was standing in the center of an interrogation disguised as courtesy. He'd faced worse rooms. He reminded himself of that, squared his shoulders and waited. Tell us, Master Windu said without preamble, what you are. Not where you're from. What you are. Naruto considered the question longer than they probably expected. Back home, that question had once been used as a weapon against him. Jinchuriki, monster, container, before he'd spent a lifetime redefining the answer on his own terms. He wasn't about to let a room full of strangers, however powerful, back him into giving the easy, frightened version of the truth. I'm a person, he said finally. I've got something inside me that isn't exactly me, old power from something my world called a tailed beast. People used to be scared of it, used to be scared of me, because of it. Took a long time and a lot of mistakes on both sides before that changed. He met Windu's stare without flinching. So, if you're asking whether I'm dangerous, yeah, I am. So's every kunai, every blaster you've all got strapped to your belts. Question that actually matters is what I do with it. Silence settled across the chamber. Yoda's eyes, ancient and unreadable, studied him with an intensity that made Naruto feel, briefly, like he was being read down to the marrow. Feel your truth in that, I do, Yoda said at last, quietly. Anger, you carry. But hatred, no. Rare. That is, in one who has known so much pain. Something in Naruto's chest eased slightly at the words, though he didn't let it show. He'd heard versions of that assessment before, from people who'd taken far longer to trust him than a 5-minute audience. There's a difference, Naruto said, echoing Ashoka's words from the ship, between what people are afraid you'll become and what you actually choose. I plan on choosing the second one. Every time, if I can help it. Windu's expression didn't soften exactly, but something in his posture shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the suspension of immediate judgment, which for a man like him was its own significant concession. The council would deliberate further, they told him. In the meantime, he would remain on Coruscant, under Jedi observation, permitted to move within defined boundaries. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't a cell, either, and Naruto had learned long ago how to make the most of spaces in between. What none of them knew, what even the Council's considerable collective wisdom hadn't yet detected, was that far across the galaxy, aboard a separatist flagship cloaked in the void beyond Christophsis, Count Dooku had already begun reviewing every scrap of sensor data his agents could gather on the anomaly the Jedi were so carefully cataloging. He steepled his fingers, considering the readings with the patient calculation of a man who had spent decades learning to recognize the shape of an opportunity long before lesser minds noticed it forming. Interesting, he thought, and reached for his calm. The Jedi Temple's residential wing was quieter than anywhere Naruto had slept since the war back home ended, and for the first 2 nights, that quiet nearly drove him insane. He wasn't used to stillness like this. No distant sound of a village waking, no Sakura shouting his name down a hallway, no Kurama's low rumble filling the silence with something like companionship. The fox's presence remained muted, still recalibrating from whatever the dimensional tear had done to their connection, present but distant, like a phone call with a bad signal. Naruto spent those first nights staring at the ceiling of his assigned quarters, turning the day's events over in his mind, wondering how many time zones and dimensions separated him now from everyone who'd ever called him Hokage.
The boredom didn't last.
It rarely did, in his experience. Trouble had a way of finding him wherever he went, and Coruscant proved no exception. His movements around the temple were restricted but not eliminated, and Naruto used every inch of the freedom he'd been given to explore, to ask questions, to learn the shape of the world he'd landed in. He spent hours in the archives with a patient young Jedi Knight named Tomas Ren, absorbing what he could about the war, the factions, the fractured political body called the Galactic Senate that governed, nominally, 1,000 worlds worth of competing interests. He learned about lightsabers and Force philosophy, about the Jedi Code's demand for detachment from fear, from anger, from attachment itself, and found himself frowning at that last part more than once. "You're not supposed to love anyone too much?" he asked Tomas, skeptical. "That doesn't sound like strength. That sounds like running away before the fight even starts." Tomas, younger than most of the council and still idealistic enough to enjoy a genuine debate, tilted his head. Attachment leads to fear of loss. Fear of loss leads to the dark side. It's not that we don't care. We're taught to care for everyone equally, without possessiveness. "Yeah, but that's not the same as loving someone," Naruto pressed. "I've almost lost everyone I care about, more than once. Didn't make me weaker. Made me fight harder. Made me stronger, actually, knowing exactly what I was fighting to protect." He shook his head. "Caring about everyone the same as everyone else. That just sounds like caring about no one, if I'm honest." Tomas didn't have a ready answer for that, and Naruto could tell the words had lodged somewhere uncomfortable, a splinter under the Jedi Code's careful philosophical armor. It wouldn't be the last time Naruto's Ninja Village pragmatism collided head-on with Jedi doctrine, but for now, the two of them let the conversation rest, an unresolved thread neither was ready to pull further. It was during one of these archive sessions that Naruto first met a clone trooper off duty, a soldier named Fixer, out of armor for the first time since Naruto had arrived, revealing a face identical to 1,000 others across the galaxy, and yet, up close, entirely his own. Scarred above one eyebrow, a crooked smile, a data pad full of hand-sketched drawings he tried, embarrassed, to hide when Naruto noticed. "You draw?" Naruto asked, genuinely curious, dropping into the seat across from him in the mess hall without waiting for invitation, a habit that had gotten him in trouble with stiffer company than a war-weary clone trooper. Fixer hesitated, clearly unused to anyone asking about anything beyond his function as a soldier. "Off-duty thing," he said finally. "Command doesn't really. It's not something we're supposed to have time for." "Why not?" Naruto asked, genuinely baffled. "Seems like exactly the kind of thing you'd need time for. War's easier to survive when you've got something waiting for you on the other side of it." Fixer studied him for a long moment. The careful, assessing look Naruto had already learned to recognize as the difference between a soldier deciding whether someone was worth trusting and one who'd already decided against it. Something in Naruto's easy sincerity must have tipped the scale, because Fixer slid the datapad across the table, revealing rough but genuinely skilled sketches. Fellow troopers in unguarded moments, laughing, resting, alive in ways their armor rarely permitted the galaxy to see. "Nobody really asks us what we want," Fixer admitted quietly. "We're grown for one purpose. Following orders is what we're built for." Naruto felt something familiar and painful twist in his chest, an echo of every conversation he'd ever had about what people were built or meant to be. Every assumption placed on him before he'd had a chance to become anything on his own terms. "You're not just what you were built for," Naruto said, quiet but certain. "Nobody is. Where I'm from, I grew up with everyone assuming I was going to be exactly what they were scared of. Took a long time, and a lot of people telling me I was wrong about myself before I figured out different. You're allowed to be more than one thing, Fixer. Soldier and artist. Both true. Both yours." Fixer didn't answer right away, but when Naruto left the mess hall an hour later, the trooper had already started a new sketch. This one, Naruto suspected without asking, might have his own whisker-marked face somewhere in it. That small exchange mattered more than Naruto initially realized. Word moved fast among the clone ranks, and within days, a handful of troopers Naruto passed in corridors offered him small nods of acknowledgement. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but the beginning recognition that the strange anomaly the Jedi were so carefully studying had, at minimum, treated one of their own like a person rather than a number. It was a start. Naruto had built entire alliances on smaller foundations than that before. The Jedi, meanwhile, remained more cautious. Master Windu observed Naruto's growing rapport with the clone ranks with a wariness he didn't bother disguising, flagging it in his reports to the Council as a potential concern, an outsider building loyalty among the Republic's soldiers faster than he was building trust among its Jedi. Master Yoda, characteristically, saw it differently. "Trust, he builds honestly," Yoda observed during a private council session, watching a whole report of Naruto's interactions. "Manipulation, this is not. Genuine, his care for others seems." "Genuine or not," Windu countered, "we still don't know what he's capable of at full power. He's operating well below whatever his baseline may be, his own words. That should concern us more than it currently does." It was a fair point, and one that would prove more prescient than even Windu suspected. Because far above Coruscant's careful political maneuvering, aboard a heavily shielded separatist vessel monitoring Republic frequencies from the edge of sanctioned space, Count Dooku had finished his analysis of the anomaly's energy signature and had begun drafting a very different kind of approach entirely. He did not intend to wait for the Jedi Council to decide what Naruto Uzumaki was worth. Kurama's voice returned in full for the first time 3 days after their arrival on Coruscant, and Naruto nearly fell out of his meditation pose from the shock of it. "There you are," the fox rumbled, presence flooding back into Naruto's mindscape with a warmth he hadn't realized how badly he'd missed until it returned. Asterisk, took long enough. "This place's energy doesn't sit right. Not evil, just foreign. Like trying to breathe underwater. Took time to adjust the flow between us. Asterisk. You okay?" Naruto asked silently, still cross-legged on the floor of his quarters, the muted evening light of Coruscant's endless artificial glow filtering through the window behind him. Asterisk, better than okay. Strong as ever. Once I stopped fighting the current instead of moving with it. Asterisk a pause. something almost like amusement coloring the enormous presence at the edge of Naruto's consciousness. Asterisk, your little force sensitives keep trying to peek in at us, by the way. Every time one gets close, I rattle the cage a little. Keeps them guessing, asterisk. That explained something that had been bothering Naruto since the council audience. The way certain Jedi flinched almost imperceptibly whenever they stood near him for too long. The way Master Windu's careful neutral expression sometimes cracked into something more startled than he'd probably intended to show. Naruto had assumed it was simple wariness. Apparently, it was Kurama, deliberately or not, making his presence felt to anyone attempting to read the strange, layered energy signature underneath Naruto's skin. "You've been messing with the Jedi?" Naruto asked, equal parts amused and exasperated. Asterisk, call it a professional courtesy. Nine-tailed beasts spent a very long time being feared, sealed, and hunted by people who thought they understood us. Forgive me for not being eager to let strangers root around in my head just because they asked nicely. Asterisk. Naruto couldn't really argue with that logic, all things considered. It did explain, at least, why the council's information gathering on him had stalled somewhat. The Force, for all its considerable insight, apparently struggled to parse a being whose power came wrapped in centuries of deliberate, defensive concealment. He filed the information away and returned his attention to the more immediate matter at hand. Ashoka had arranged, with Master Core's cautious blessing, for Naruto to demonstrate a portion of his abilities in one of the temple's training solace, partly out of genuine Jedi curiosity, partly, Naruto suspected, as a controlled test to gauge exactly how dangerous he actually was. The cell was a wide, high-ceilinged chamber ringed with training remotes and reinforced walls scarred from decades of lightsaber practice. A small audience had gathered: Ashoka, Master Core, Tomas Ren, and to Naruto's mild surprise, Master Windu himself, arms crossed, positioned near the exit in a way that made his skepticism plain without a single word spoken. "Show us what you can do," Core said. "Nothing lethal. We simply need to understand what we're dealing with." Naruto rolled his shoulders, feeling something loosen in his chest at the prospect of finally moving after days of careful conversation and cautious diplomacy. This, at least, was a language he'd always understood better than words. "Shadow clone jutsu," he said, snapping his fingers together in a familiar seal. A dozen identical Narutos bloomed into existence around the cell in a puff of displaced air, each one grinning the exact same grin, each one very clearly, distinctly real rather than illusion, a fact confirmed instantly by Ashoka's sharp intake of breath and Tomas's stunned step backward. "They're not projections," Tomas said, staring. "I can sense each one individually. Distinct life signs. That shouldn't be possible." "Chakra clones," Naruto said, several of his duplicates saying it in unison a half-second later, an effect that clearly unsettled the watching Jedi more than he'd anticipated. "Split my chakra, split myself. Each one's 100% me, memories, skills, everything, until they pop." He grinned. "Great for scouting. Great for overwhelming numbers. Also great for finishing chores twice as fast. Not that you've got chores here, I've noticed." Windu's arms remained crossed, but something in his expression had shifted from skepticism toward genuine, guarded interest. "Continue," he said simply. Naruto obliged. He demonstrated the Rasengan next, a swirling orb of concentrated chakra spinning to life in his palm with a sound like tearing wind, and watched every Jedi in the room lean forward slightly, professional curiosity overriding caution for just a moment. He showed them a portion of Sage Mode, carefully, deliberately holding back from drawing on the full weight of Six Paths power, mindful of Kurama's earlier warning about the energy drain such techniques cost him in this recalibrated state, and watched the room's temperature seem to drop as the Jedi present all, simultaneously, felt something shift in the force around him. "That," Master Core said slowly, "is a considerably different signature than your baseline. What exactly did you just do?" "Sage Mode," Naruto explained. "Pulling in natural energy from the world around me. Not the same as your force, I don't think, but maybe adjacent? Combines with my own chakra. Makes everything stronger. Sharper senses, more power, faster reactions." He let the glowing orange marking around his eyes fade, the sensation of drawn natural energy retreating back to its source. I've got more than that, too. A lot more. But that's usually the point where things start getting expensive to maintain here, so I don't want to push it without knowing what it'll cost me. Windu finally uncrossed his arms, stepping further into the cell, studying Naruto with the particular intensity of a man recalculating a threat assessment in real time. "You're being deliberately cautious with us," he observed, holding back. "I'm being deliberately cautious with myself," Naruto corrected. "Big difference. I don't know this world yet. Don't know exactly what my full power costs here, or what it might break if I'm not careful. Last thing I want is to accidentally level a city block because I didn't understand the rules yet." He shrugged. "Ask anyone who's known me a while. I learn by doing. But even I know better than to test the biggest fireworks in a room full of strangers I haven't earned trust with yet." It was, Naruto knew even as he said it, exactly the kind of answer that would either deepen the Jedi's trust or their suspicion, and he couldn't fully predict which way it would break. Windu's expression remained unreadable. Master Kor's, by contrast, had softened considerably, the specific respect of one warrior recognizing another's discipline. "Restraint," Kor said quietly, "is not something we anticipated from an unknown power source capable of what we just witnessed." "That speaks well of you." Naruto allowed himself a small, genuine smile at that, the first real crack of approval he'd earned from the Jedi since his arrival. Small victories. He'd learned a long time ago that trust was built one honest moment at a time, never all at once, and he had every intention of proving himself brick by careful brick until even Windu's guarded caution gave way to something more. What none of them in the cell that afternoon could have anticipated was that their demonstration hadn't gone unwitnessed. A modified surveillance drone, disguised as temple maintenance equipment and slipped into place days earlier by an agent whose loyalties belonged entirely to the separatist cause, had recorded every technique, every flare of unfamiliar energy, every word spoken in that training cell, and was already transmitting the data across encrypted channels toward a separatist flagship waiting patiently in the dark beyond the Outer Rim. Count Dooku watched the recording twice through, and by the second viewing, his considering expression had shifted into something closer to certainty. Extraordinary, he thought, steepling his fingers as the Rasengan's swirling image froze mid-playback. Asterisk, and so very unaligned. A power like that, still deciding where its loyalties belong. The Jedi will smother it in doctrine before they ever learn to properly wield it. Asterisk. He reached for his private comm channel, already composing, in his mind, the precise words an outsider desperate to understand a strange new galaxy might find most persuasive. The message arrived 4 days later, delivered by a method that shouldn't have been possible given the temple's considerable security measures, which was, Naruto would later realize, precisely the point. He found it waiting on the small personal datapad the Jedi had issued him for accessing the archives, a single unmarked file that hadn't come through any official channel. When he opened it, a modest, unassuming text message resolved on the screen. No sender identification, no traceable origin the temple's technicians could later locate. Asterisk, you are a long way from home. Naruto Uzumaki. I imagine the Jedi have been generous with their caution and sparing with their honesty. I would offer you both an honest conversation and the freedom to walk away from it unharmed regardless of your answer. Meet me, if you're curious, at the coordinates attached. Come alone, or don't come at all. The choice, as it should be, is entirely yours. Asterisk.
D.
Naruto stared at the message for a long time, Kurama's presence stirring uneasily at the edge of his awareness. Don't like this, the fox rumbled. Smells like a trap dressed up as an invitation. Maybe, Naruto thought back. But it's also the first time since I got here that anyone's offered me a choice instead of a decision already made on my behalf. That distinction mattered more to him than he could easily explain to Kurama or to himself. The Jedi had been careful with him, courteous even, but every conversation still carried the underlying architecture of an institution deciding what to do about him rather than with him. This message, whoever had sent it, treated him as an agent with his own judgment to exercise. Manipulative, possibly, But also, Naruto suspected, deliberately so, someone who understood exactly what kind of appeal would land with him specifically. He thought about telling Ashoka. He thought about it seriously, turning the data pad over in his hands, weighing loyalty against curiosity against the very real possibility that walking into an unsanctioned meeting with an unknown party in the middle of a war zone was, by any reasonable measure, a spectacularly bad idea. In the end, he went anyway, but not blindly. He left a message of his own, sealed and time-delayed, addressed to Ashoka, explaining where he'd gone and why, set to deliver automatically if he didn't return within 6 hours. It wasn't the same as asking permission. But it wasn't reckless secrecy either, and Naruto had learned the difference mattered, both practically and to the people who'd eventually have to trust him with harder truths than this one. The coordinates led him to an abandoned observation platform on Coruscant's undercity levels, far below the glittering spires where senators and Jedi conducted the galaxy's business, down where sunlight never reached and the city's forgotten machinery hummed in perpetual dim twilight. Naruto arrived to find a single figure waiting, tall, silver-haired, dressed in dark, understated finery that somehow read as more dangerous than any armor Naruto had seen since his arrival. The man's presence in the Force, even Naruto's still recalibrating senses could tell, was old and disciplined and utterly without hesitation. Count Dooku, the man said, inclining his head with the exact measure of courtesy that suggested he never gave more than precisely what a situation required. I appreciate you coming. Truly. You're the guy the Jedi keep mentioning like a bad omen, Naruto said, not bothering to disguise his wariness, hands loose at his sides but ready. Separatist leader. Former Jedi yourself, from what I've heard. Accurate, if incomplete, as most Jedi summaries of me tend to be. Dooku's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I left the order because I came to understand what you are perhaps only beginning to suspect, Naruto, that an institution built on doctrine will always value its doctrine over the individuals it claims to serve. The Jedi did not offer you power. They offered you observation. Careful, conditional trust, extended only as far as their comfort allows. And you're offering something different, Naruto said flatly. It wasn't a question. I'm offering honesty, Dooku said. You possess power the likes of which this galaxy has never catalogued. The Jedi will spend years, should you allow them that long, attempting to fit you into their philosophical framework, teaching you to suppress instinct in favor of detachment, teaching you that the very attachments which clearly define your strength are, in fact, your greatest liability. I've read the Temple's internal assessments of you, Naruto. Even now, they debate whether your compassion is virtue or vulnerability. Naruto's jaw tightened, because the words landed closer to a truth he'd already half-sensed himself than he wanted to admit. And what do you think it is? I think, Dooku said, that a being who fights hardest for the people he loves is not weak. I think the galaxy has enough passionless observers already, watching wars unfold from a careful, doctrinal distance while worlds burn beneath them. I am building something different, an alliance unburdened by a Senate too corrupt to govern honestly, unburdened by a Jedi order too rigid to adapt. I could use someone like you, Naruto, not as a weapon, as an equal. It was, Naruto had to admit, a genuinely skilled pitch, precisely calibrated to every doubt he'd already been quietly nursing about Jedi doctrine, wrapped around exactly enough truth to make the poison harder to taste. He thought of Nagato, of every villain he'd ever faced who'd built their entire ideology on a real, legitimate grievance twisted just far enough to justify anything that came after. You're good at this, Naruto said, almost admiring, even as he kept his guard fully raised. Really good. Almost had me nodding along for a second there. Dooku's expression didn't shift, though something in his eyes sharpened with genuine attention. But I've heard this speech before, Naruto said. Different words, different galaxy, same shape. Guy with real grievances, real reasons to be angry, dresses up, burn it all down and let me lead what's left as liberation. I've saved people who used to talk exactly like you. Doesn't mean I trust the ones still talking though. He met Dooku's gaze steadily. The Republic's flawed. I've seen that much already. Doesn't mean tearing it apart, and calling yourself the alternative makes you the good guy. Just means you're offering a different kind of cage, with better lighting. For the first time since Naruto's arrival on the platform, something like genuine surprise flickered across Dooku's composed features, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough. A pity, Dooku said finally, voice cooling several degrees. I had hoped you'd prove less predictably naive than the Jedi you're so quick to distance yourself from. Not naive, Naruto said. Just not stupid enough to trust a stranger's honeyed offer over my own judgment. I make my own choices, Dooku. Always have. That's kind of the whole point of me. He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back over his shoulder. For what it's worth, I don't think you're entirely wrong about the Republic. Or the Jedi. Doesn't mean I'm going to help you burn either one down, though. There's usually a better answer than the two extremes people offer you. Took me a long time to learn that. Maybe you will too someday. Dooku watched him walk away into the Undercity's perpetual gloom, expression settling into something colder and more calculating than the courteous mask he'd worn throughout their conversation. A pity indeed, he murmured to himself once Naruto was well out of earshot, already reaching for his comm to contact a very different sort of ally, one considerably less concerned with honeyed offers and considerably more comfortable with force. Then we shall simply have to be more persuasive. Naruto made it back to the Jedi Temple with 20 minutes to spare before his delayed message to Ashoka would have triggered, and found her waiting for him at the transport bay entrance regardless, arms crossed, expression carved from equal parts worry and irritation. You went to meet Dooku alone, she said, before he'd even finished stepping off the lift. Do you have any idea how reckless that was? Left you a message, Naruto pointed out mildly. Set to send automatically if I didn't check back in. Wasn't reckless. Was careful, actually just careful in a way that didn't ask permission first. That's not the same thing as careful. That's just... Ashoka stopped herself, visibly reeling her frustration back in, and exhaled slowly. You could have told me before you went. I would have understood. Would you have let me go? The silence that followed answered the question more honestly than words could have. That's what I figured, Naruto said, not unkindly. Look, I get why you're worried. I do. But I needed to hear what he had to say myself, without a room full of Jedi filtering it through what you're all afraid I'll become. Turns out he's exactly what everyone warned me about.
Smart, though.
Real smart. Almost had me halfway convinced before I caught the shape of it. He relayed the conversation in full as they walked back through the temple's corridors. Dooku's offer. The careful, precise way the Count had aimed for every doubt Naruto had been quietly nursing about Jedi doctrine, and his own refusal. Ashoka listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from anger towards something more complicated as the account unfolded. You turned him down, she said finally. Just like that. Just like that, Naruto confirmed. Doesn't mean he was wrong about everything, though. Some of what he said about the Jedi, about doctrine mattering more than the people it's supposed to protect, that landed somewhere real. Doesn't mean the answer is his answer. Burning it all down and calling yourself the alternative isn't liberation, it's just a different flavor of control. He shrugged. I've seen that particular trick before. Recognize it pretty easy by now. Master Windu, informed of the unsanctioned meeting through Ashoka's immediate report, arrived at the debriefing with an expression that suggested he was recalculating his threat assessment of Naruto for what felt like the third time that week. You met with Count Dooku. Alone. Without authorization. Windu said, each word deliberate. Do you understand the risk that represented, to yourself and potentially to this entire temple had it gone differently? I understand it, Naruto said, meeting the Jedi Master's stare without flinching. I also understand that if I'm going to decide who to trust in this galaxy, I need to make those calls myself sometimes, not just accept whatever version of the truth gets filtered down to me through people still deciding whether I'm a threat worth watching. You've been careful with me. I get why. But careful and honest aren't always the same thing, and I needed to hear Dooku's pitch straight from him to know exactly what I was refusing. Windu's jaw tightened, but something in his rigid posture eased fractionally. Not approval, not yet, but the particular respect one disciplined mind offers another, however grudgingly. And your answer to him? No, Naruto said simply. Told him burning down a broken system and calling yourself the fix doesn't make you the good guy. Just makes you the next version of the same problem. He held Winda's gaze. For what it's worth, I think you all know the Republic's got real problems too. I've been here 2 weeks, and even I can see the cracks. Doesn't mean I'm about to go help Dooku smash the whole thing to prove a point. There's always a better answer between accept everything broken and burn everything down. Took me a long time to learn that back home. Figured it might apply here too. The council convened an emergency session that evening to discuss the implications, both the security breach that had allowed Dooku's message to slip past temple defenses undetected, and the more unsettling reality that Naruto had proven capable of resisting a direct, sophisticated Sith recruitment attempt entirely on his own judgment, without Jedi guidance or intervention. He refused Dooku, Yoda said, turning the fact over with evident consideration during the council's private deliberation. Refused. Without our counsel. Without our doctrine to guide him. Interesting this is. Or concerning, Winda countered, though with noticeably less conviction than his earlier objections had carried. He operates entirely on his own moral compass, unmoored from any institutional accountability. Today it led him to refuse the Sith. Tomorrow, absent any framework beyond his own instincts, it might lead him somewhere less fortunate. Instincts you call it, Yoda mused. Perhaps. Or perhaps a moral compass forged through struggle far different from our own, but no less true for its difference. He tapped his Jimmer stick once, thoughtfully. Trust his heart's direction? I am inclined to. Trust his methods entirely, that still I withhold. Time, this will require. Patience from us both. The council's deliberations, unresolved as they remained, mattered less to Naruto that evening than the quieter conversation he found himself having with Ashoka afterward, seated on a balcony overlooking Coruscant's endless artificial glow, the city's lights stretching to every horizon like a galaxy compressed onto a single sprawling world. Can I ask you something? Ashoka said, after a long comfortable silence had stretched between them. Back where you're from, did you ever get an offer like Dooku's? Someone promising you power, freedom from whatever cage people kept trying to put you in. Naruto's expression turned thoughtful, distant, memory surfacing behind his eyes.
Yeah.
More than once, actually. Guy named Obito, way back, offered me a world where nobody ever had to hurt or lose anyone again. Sounded almost decent on the surface. Turned out to be built on lies and a whole lot of suffering underneath. He shook his head slowly. Another guy, Nagato, he wasn't wrong that the world was broken, that people kept hurting each other in cycles that never really ended. He was just wrong about the fix. Thought enough pain, enough fear, might finally force peace into existence. A faint, sad smile. Took losing almost everything before he saw a better way. I try to remember that when I meet people like Dooku, even the ones who scare me, most of them started somewhere that wasn't so different from anyone else. That's a generous way to see someone who just tried to recruit you to a war, Ashoka observed. Maybe, Naruto allowed. Doesn't mean I won't fight him if it comes to that. Just means I try not to hate him while I'm doing it. Hate's got a way of eating you from the inside before it ever touches the person you're aiming it at. Learned that lesson the hard way, more than once. Ashoka studied him for a long moment, something in her expression shifting, not quite Jedi detachment, not quite the careful neutrality she'd been trained toward, but something warmer and more curious breaking through despite herself. You really believe that? That almost anyone can be reached, given the right conditions? I believe it because I've seen it, Naruto said simply. Doesn't always work. Doesn't mean I stop trying, though. That's kind of the whole deal with me. Far above them, cloaked in the vast dark between Coruscant's orbital shipping lanes, a modified separatist cruiser held position, its sensors quietly tracking a specific energy signature it had been ordered to monitor, and, should the opportunity present itself, to capture, whatever the cost. Count Dooku's patience, it seemed, had already begun wearing thin. The attack came without warning, 3 days after Naruto's meeting with Dooku, and it came not for him directly, but for something he'd only just begun to understand mattered just as much. The people he'd started, however cautiously, to consider his own. It began with a distress signal from a mid-rim settlement called Hallis Reach, a modest agricultural colony supplying grain shipments to Republic forces stationed throughout the sector. Separatist forces had bypassed the world entirely for most of the war, deeming it strategically insignificant, until, apparently, someone in the Separatist command structure decided otherwise. A detachment of battle droids descended on the settlement with brutal efficiency, targeting infrastructure, granaries, water purification systems. Not conquest, Naruto realized with a cold, familiar dread as the reports came in, but punishment. A message, aimed with surgical precision at Naruto himself, delivered through the suffering of people who'd had nothing to do with any of it. He knew, even before the Jedi briefing confirmed it, exactly whose hand had guided the strike. "This isn't standard Separatist tactics," Master Kor said grimly, studying the incoming damage reports in the temple's war room. Naruto standing beside him, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. "Hallis Reach has no strategic value. This is retaliation."
For me, Naruto said.
It wasn't a question. "We don't know that for certain," Ashoka started, though her voice lacked conviction even as she said it.
"We do," Naruto said.
"I turned Dooku down 4 days ago."
Told him no.
This is him proving a point, that saying no to him has a cost, and he's happy to make other people pay it instead of me. His voice had gone low, dangerous, Kurama's chakra stirring faint and hot beneath his skin in response to the anger building in his chest. "How many people are down there?" "Approximately 3,000 civilians," Kor said. "A skeleton Republic garrison. Nothing capable of repelling a coordinated droid assault of this scale." Naruto didn't wait for the Council's official authorization. He was already moving toward the hangar bay before Kor had finished the sentence, and it was only Ashoka's quick pursuit and quicker words that stopped him at the threshold. "You can't just charge in there alone," she said, falling into step beside him. "Let me come. Officially. Let the Council send proper support." "There's no time for proper," Naruto said, though he slowed his pace fractionally, some hard-won part of him recognizing the wisdom in not repeating the same unilateral mistake twice in 1 week. "People are dying right now, Ashoka. Every minute we spend debating jurisdiction is another minute closer to that settlement not existing anymore." In the end, it was Master Kor himself who authorized the response, a rapid deployment force built around a clone platoon, Ashoka and Naruto, dispatched without the full Council's deliberation, on Kor's own authority as ranking Jedi General for the sector. It was, Naruto understood even in the chaos of preparation, a genuine risk for the older Jedi to take, vouching for an unknown quantities judgment against protocol that existed precisely to prevent this kind of hasty, unvetted action. "Don't make me regret this," Kor said quietly as their transport prepared for departure. "I won't," Naruto promised, and meant it with everything he had. The battle for Hallis Reach was, by any measure, a mess. Droids entrenched among burning granaries, civilians scattered and terrified across a settlement never built to withstand siege warfare, a Republic garrison stretched thin and taking casualties faster than they could hold ground. Naruto arrived at the edge of the conflict and, for the first time since his arrival in this galaxy, stopped holding back. Shadow clones bloomed across the battlefield by the dozens, each one moving with independent tactical awareness, tearing through droid formations with a speed and coordination that left even the veteran clone troopers momentarily stunned into silence. Naruto himself moved like something between a blur and a natural disaster, Rasengan blooming in his palm again and again, each strike calculated not for maximum destruction but for precision, disabling droids, clearing paths, always angling his violence away from the civilians still trapped in the crossfire. "Get the wounded to the eastern shelter," he shouted to a cluster of terrified settlers, a shadow clone already moving to physically shield an elderly farmer from incoming blaster fire. Go, I've got this side covered." It was, Ashoka would later report to the Council with something bordering on awe, unlike anything she'd witnessed in 4 years of war. Not the disciplined, doctrine-guided fighting style of a Jedi, but something rawer and more instinctive, built entirely around a singular, unwavering priority. Protect the people who can't protect themselves, whatever it costs. The turning point came when Naruto discovered the droid's true objective, not the settlement itself, but a granary complex rigged with explosives, timed to detonate with the settlement's remaining civilian population sheltered inside. A final, devastating message calculated with the same cold precision Naruto had come to associate with Dooku's particular brand of manipulation. He didn't hesitate, didn't calculate risk or consider consequence. He simply moved, faster than thought, tearing through the granary's defensive droid perimeter with Sage Mode's enhanced speed and strength, natural energy marking around his eyes as he ripped the explosive charges free one by one, shadow clones working in perfect synchronized coordination to evacuate the last terrified civilians even as the countdown ticked toward zero. The final charge came free with seconds to spare. Naruto hurled it skyward with everything Sage-enhanced strength could offer, and the resulting detonation lit the evening sky in a brilliant, harmless flash high above the settlement, devastating in scale, but claiming no lives beyond the droids caught in its blast radius. Silence fell across Hallis Reach in the aftermath, broken only by the crackle of dying droid chassis and the ragged, disbelieving breathing of 3,000 people who, moments earlier, had been counting down toward their own deaths. Master Core found Naruto afterward, standing amid the wreckage, Sage Mode fading from his features, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried him through the fight. "You disregarded protocol at nearly every turn," Core observed, though there was no real reprimand in his tone, only quiet, considered assessment. "Prioritized civilian evacuation over tactical positioning. Took personal risks a Jedi general would never have sanctioned for a single operative." "Would you have done differently?" Naruto asked, too tired for diplomacy. Core was silent for a long moment, watching settlers embrace their rescued families across the ruined granary complex. "No," he admitted finally. "I would not have. But I am bound by a code that asks me to weigh such choices more carefully than my heart alone would prefer." "You're not so bound. That is either your greatest strength in this galaxy, Naruto Uzumaki," he turned to look at him directly, "or eventually, your undoing. I confess I do not yet know which." "Maybe it's both," Naruto said quietly, watching the settlement survivors begin, slowly, to rebuild. Most important things usually are. Above them, unnoticed in the chaos of rescue and recovery, a single separatist reconnaissance probe recorded the full extent of what Naruto had just demonstrated and related, without delay, to a very interested audience waiting patiently at the edges of the war. The footage from Hallis Reach reached Coruscant's HoloNet news services within 48 hours, heavily edited and recontextualized by unknown parties whose fingerprints, upon investigation, led nowhere conclusive, though Naruto had his suspicions about who benefited most from the story's particular framing. The broadcast painted him as something between miracle and menace, an unregistered, unaccountable power operating with Republic sanction, capable of leveling droid formations single-handedly, disregarding military protocol at will. Some segments framed it as inspiring, a hero the Republic desperately needed in a war grinding toward its fifth exhausting year. Others painted a more unsettling picture, questioning aloud what such power might do if it ever turned against the Republic instead of for it, and who, precisely, held any real authority to stop him if it did. "They're using me," Naruto said flatly, watching the broadcast loop in the temple's briefing room, jaw tight. "Doesn't matter what actually happened at Hallis Reach. Matters what story gets people scared or grateful enough to pay attention." "Welcome to galactic politics," Ashoka said grimly. "Everything's a narrative to somebody." The Senate, predictably, seized on the controversy with the particular enthusiasm reserved for anything that generated both fear and viewership. Within days, an emergency subcommittee had convened to debate what one senator memorably termed the Uzumaki question, whether an unregistered, non-Republic entity of Naruto's demonstrated capability should be permitted to operate within Republic space at all, Jedi sponsorship notwithstanding. Naruto found himself, for the first time since his arrival, summoned not before the Jedi Council but before a Senate committee, a very different kind of room, he discovered quickly, built around performance and political leverage rather than any genuine attempt at understanding. "Mr. Uzumaki," began Senator Halverthane, a sharp-featured man from a core world whose voice carried the practiced cadence of someone who delivered thousands of speeches to rooms exactly like this one. You arrived in Republic space with no documentation, no verifiable origin, and demonstrated capabilities that, by your own admission, remain only partially understood even by yourself. Why should this body extend you any trust whatsoever? Naruto had faced interrogations before, village councils suspicious of the fox sealed inside him, elders who'd wanted him controlled, contained, made safe by whatever means necessary. He recognized the shape of this conversation immediately, however dressed up in different robes and different vocabulary. You shouldn't extend me trust, Naruto said, and watched several senators blink in surprise at the blunt honesty. Trust isn't something you're owed for existing. It's something you earn, one choice at a time. I get that you don't know me. Fair enough, I don't know most of you either. But I'd ask you to judge me by what I actually do, not by how scary the story sounds when someone edits the footage to make it sound that way. And what you did, Thane pressed, was deploy unregistered lethal force in a Republic engagement without proper military authorization. What I did, Naruto corrected, voice hardening, was save 3,000 civilians from a granary rigged to kill every last one of them. Ask the people of Hallis Reach whether they cared about my paperwork while I was pulling explosive charges out of a building full of their families. I didn't see a single Senate representative on that battlefield helping evacuate anyone. Just Jedi, clone troopers, and me, actually doing something instead of arguing about jurisdiction from somewhere safe. The chamber erupted into a mixture of scattered applause and outraged murmuring, and Naruto caught, out of the corner of his eye, Master Windu's expression, something that might, in a more demonstrative man, have qualified as approval. Senator Thane's expression tightened, though he pivoted smoothly, unwilling to concede ground so easily. A commendable act, perhaps. But commendable acts do not erase the fundamental question of accountability. Who governs your actions, Mr. Uzumaki? To whom do you answer, should your judgment ever fail as catastrophically as your power might allow? It was, Naruto had to admit, a fair question, perhaps the only genuinely fair question anyone in the chamber had asked him. He considered his answer carefully before speaking. Myself, he said finally. That's the honest answer, and I know it's not the one you want to hear. I don't have a chain of command here. Don't have an institution vouching for every choice I make. What I've got is a track record I'm building, one decision at a time, and people like Master Core, like Ashoka, watching close enough to call me out if I ever get it wrong. He met Thane's gaze steadily. I've made mistakes before. Big ones. Ones that hurt people I cared about. I don't pretend I'm incapable of getting it wrong again. But you asking me to hand my judgment over to a committee that's never once set foot on a battlefield, that's not accountability. That's just a different kind of cage, and I've spent enough of my life pushing back against people who wanted to put me in one. The hearing extended for another 2 hours, circling questions of jurisdiction, precedent, and political optics that Naruto found increasingly exhausting compared to the comparative clarity of actual combat. No formal resolution emerged. The Senate, true to its reputation, proved far more skilled at deliberation than decision, but the committee ultimately declined to recommend any formal restriction on Naruto's movement or activities, outcome Master Core later described, dryly, as the closest thing to a Senate victory you're likely to experience. It was during the walk back to the temple transport, drained and unexpectedly rattled by the day's political theater, that Naruto found himself confiding something he hadn't planned to share. Back home, he told Ashoka quietly, I became a leader eventually. Hokage, like your chancellor, sort of, except I actually had to earn it, prove myself to people who spent years doubting whether I deserved the position at all. Thought once I got there, once people finally saw me as more than just what they were scared of, it'd feel different than this. He shook his head. Still feels the same, though. Still people deciding what story to believe about you before they bother asking who you actually are. For what it's worth, Ashoka said, I don't need the story. I've seen who you actually are. Naruto smiled at that, genuine and tired in equal measure.
Yeah.
Guess that's something at least. Neither of them noticed, as their transport lifted away from the Senate district, a modest surveillance implant embedded weeks earlier within the very committee chamber they'd just left. One more piece of intelligence gathering, patiently, methodically, toward a plan whose next phase Count Dooku had already set irrevocably into motion. Master Ivis Kor found Naruto 3 days after the Senate hearing, seated alone on one of the temple's high garden terraces, watching Coruscant's traffic streams weave endless patterns of light across the darkening sky. The old Jedi settled into the seat beside him without invitation, a familiarity that had grown between them in the weeks since Hallis Reach. "You've been quiet," Kor observed. "Thinking," Naruto said. "About something you said. After the granary. About the code asking you to weigh things more carefully than your heart alone would prefer."
Ah.
Kor's expression turned contemplative. "That conversation stayed with you."
Yeah.
Naruto drew his knees up, wrapping his arms around them. A posture more boyish than the weight of everything he'd survived usually allowed him to indulge. "I keep thinking about Nagato. Guy I mentioned before, the one who thought enough pain could force peace into the world. He wasn't wrong that people kept hurting each other in cycles that never really ended. Whole villages built on that cycle. Actually, hatred passed down like inheritance, kids raised to hate people their grandparents never even met, just 'cause that's what tradition demanded." He shook his head slowly. "I used to think the answer was simple. Just choose different. Choose not to hate, no matter what history handed you." "And now?" Kor asked, sensing there was more beneath the surface of Naruto's reflection. "Now I've watched your Jedi code up close for weeks," Naruto said. "And it's not that different, honestly. Just flipped around. Instead of teaching kids to hate, you're teaching them to not feel, not fear, not attachment, not anger, none of it. Like emotion itself is the enemy instead of what people choose to do with it." He turned to look at Kor directly. "I don't think detachment's the same thing as peace, Master Kor. I think it's just a different kind of running away. You're not solving the problem attachment creates, the fear of loss, the risk of falling to anger. You're just avoiding it entirely and calling the avoidance wisdom." Kor was quiet for a long moment, considering the challenge with the seriousness it deserved rather than dismissing it as the naivety of an outsider unfamiliar with millennia of Jedi philosophy. "You believe attachment can be held without falling to the fear it invites," Kor said finally. "That the code is wrong to treat fear of loss as inevitable corruption." "I believe attachment's what saved me," Naruto said, voice fierce with conviction hard-won through genuine loss. "Every person I've ever loved, ever fought to protect, that's not weakness. That's the whole reason I never gave up, even when giving up would have been so much easier." "You're telling your Jedi that loving someone enough to fear losing them is a doorway to darkness. I'm telling you it's the opposite. It's the thing that keeps you fighting for the light, even when the fight gets so hard you'd rather just stop feeling anything at all." "And yet," Kor said gently, "attachment has led others to darkness. Fear of loss has driven good people to terrible choices, in your galaxy as much as ours, I suspect." "Sure," Naruto agreed. "Fear of loss twisted wrong, turned into control, into refusing to let people make their own choices, into hurting others to protect what you're scared of losing. Yeah, that's real. That's dangerous. But the answer to that isn't attachment. It's growth. It's learning to love people without needing to control the outcome. Loving someone enough to let them go, if that's what they need, even though it terrifies you." He met Kor's eyes. Nagato eventually understood that right before the end. Wished he'd figured it out sooner, before all the pain he caused trying to force peace into existence through fear instead of earning it through connection. "I think some of your Jedi are going to learn that lesson the hard way too, someday, if the code keeps teaching them that caring less is the same thing as caring wisely." Master Kor said nothing for a long while, the silence stretching comfortable rather than tense between them, twin moons of Coruscant's endless traffic lights reflecting in his contemplative eyes. "You may be voicing a critique older than either of us realizes," Kor said finally. "There have been Jedi throughout our history who questioned whether the code's demand for detachment serves wisdom, or merely fear dressed in wisdom's robes. Master Kagan Jin, whom I knew personally, held views not dissimilar to your own. He believed the living force, presence, connection, genuine feeling, mattered more than rigid doctrine ever could." "What happened to him?" He died believing it, Core said simply. Whether he was right remains, even now, a debate within the Order that no council session has ever fully resolved. He turned to study Naruto with something that might have been genuine respect. You arrived in this galaxy a stranger to everything we understand about the Force, and yet you've stumbled, within mere weeks, into a philosophical fracture line that has divided Jedi thought for generations. That is either remarkable insight or remarkable coincidence. I confess I am uncertain which. Maybe it's neither, Naruto said, a faint smile finally breaking through his earlier intensity. Maybe some truths just look the same, no matter what galaxy you find them in. The conversation might have continued deeper into the night had an urgent priorities signal not interrupted them both. Ashoka's voice, tight with barely restrained tension, summoning them to the temple's command center with a single sentence that dissolved the philosophical calm of the terrace entirely. Asterisk bounty hunters have entered Coruscant airspace. Target confirmed as Naruto Uzumaki. Multiple hostile contacts inbound. Asterisk. Core was on his feet instantly, decades of war-honed instinct overriding contemplation in a heartbeat. Naruto rose beside him, Kurama's presence already surging warm and alert beneath his skin, some quieter, more reflective part of their conversation folding away to make room for whatever violence was about to arrive at the temple's doorstep. Dooku, Naruto said, certainty settling cold and clear in his chest. Almost certainly, Core agreed grimly, already moving toward the command center at a pace just short of a run. It seems the Senate hearing convinced someone that capturing you outright would prove more useful than continued recruitment. Naruto followed, jaw set, the philosophical weight of their earlier conversation giving way entirely to the far more immediate question of how many hunters Dooku had sent, and what, precisely, they'd been ordered to do with him once they caught him. The command center was already a controlled storm of activity by the time Naruto and Core arrived, holographic displays tracking 6 distinct signatures converging on Coruscant from different vectors, each one flagged with a threat profile that made even the veteran tactical officers exchange uneasy glances. 6 confirmed hunters, Ashoka reported, already moving toward the tactical table, her earlier tension sharpened now into focused urgency. Cross-referencing bounty networks, we've identified at least 4, Sabo Tar, a Deveronian tracker with a reputation for never losing a mark. Riza Voss, freelance, specializes in capture rather than kills. That's concerning given the context. 2 unidentified signatures moving in tandem, possibly separatists contracted rather than independent operators. Dooku's not just posting an open bounty, Master Windu said grimly, arriving at the command center at a pace that suggested he'd run the length of the temple to get there. He's coordinated a specific operation. Capture, not kill, which tells us he still believes Naruto can be turned, or at minimum, wants him alive for study or leverage. Comforting, Naruto muttered, watching the tactical displays converging signatures with a knot tightening in his stomach that had nothing to do with fear for himself and everything to do with what 6 professional hunters, operating in Coruscant's densely populated undercity, might be willing to sacrifice to secure their target. They won't limit themselves to clean engagement, Core said, echoing the exact concern building in Naruto's chest. Bounty hunters of this caliber will use hostages, collateral damage, whatever leverage proves effective. If they corner you in a populated sector, then I don't let them corner me in a populated sector, Naruto said, already moving toward the door. Better I go to them than let them bring the fight somewhere 3 million people are trying to live their lives. That's precisely the kind of reckless unilateral action that got you into a Senate hearing 2 days ago, Windu said sharply. Maybe, Naruto agreed, not slowing. But last time it was me talking to one guy on an empty platform. This time it's 6 hunters willing to hurt however many people it takes to get what they want, in the middle of a city.
Different math, Master Windu.
I'm not asking permission this time either, but I'd rather have backup than not if you're offering. Windu's jaw tightened, some internal calculation resolving with visible reluctance. Ashoka, Master Core, accompany him. Coordinate through proper channels this time, at minimum. A pause, something almost like grudging respect entering his tone despite himself. And Naruto, Try to bring at least one of them back alive. Intelligence on Dooku's current operational network would prove considerably valuable. No promises, Naruto said, already breaking into a run toward the hangar. But I'll try. The pursuit that followed carried Naruto, Ashoka, and a small clone escort deep into Coruscant's mid-level industrial districts, tracking the hunters' converging signatures toward what tactical analysis suggested was a deliberate ambush point, an abandoned factory complex, isolated enough to limit civilian exposure, open enough to allow 6 coordinated operators to box in a single target from multiple angles. Naruto understood the trap the moment he saw it, and understood, just as quickly, that walking into it anyway remained his best option. Better here, isolated, than dragged through populated streets with hostages as leverage. They know I'm coming, he said, studying the factory's silhouette against Coruscant's perpetual glow. This is deliberate. They want me here. Then we go in prepared for exactly that, Ashoka said, lightsaber hilt already in hand.
Together.
The engagement, once it began, unfolded with a brutal, escalating intensity that tested every ounce of adaptation Naruto had managed since his arrival. Sabo Tar proved every bit as skilled as his reputation suggested, tracking Naruto's shadow clones with uncanny precision that suggested specialized equipment calibrated specifically to counter exactly this kind of tactic. No doubt Dooku's intelligence gathering paying dividends in the hunter's preparation. Riza Voss deployed restraint-focused weaponry, ion-dampening nets, and capture cables designed to neutralize rather than kill, confirming Winda's earlier assessment that Dooku wanted him alive. It was the 2 unidentified operators, moving with disciplined, coordinated precision that spoke of formal training rather than freelance opportunism, who proved most dangerous, and it was mid-battle, ducking beneath a capture net and driving a Rasengan into a support strut to bring down cover between himself and Voss's position, that Naruto caught sight of something that made the entire engagement's true shape click into horrifying focus. Civilians, factory workers, evidently caught in the district despite the late hour, herded into a corner of the complex by one of the unidentified operators, not casualties of the crossfire, but deliberate hostages, exactly the leverage Core had warned him about, deployed the moment the engagement's early exchanges had failed to secure a clean capture. Uzumaki called the operator holding the hostages, voice carrying easily across the factory floor's echoing space. Lower your weapons and surrender, or these workers pay for your continued resistance. Naruto felt something cold and familiar settle over him, the specific, terrible clarity that arrived whenever someone he couldn't reach fast enough hung in the balance. Ashoka, several meters away and locked in her own engagement against Sabo Tar, caught his eye across the factory floor, both of them recognizing simultaneously that the calculus of the fight had just changed entirely. Don't, Ashoka called, correctly reading the decision already forming in Naruto's expression. It's exactly what they want. I know, Naruto said, and lowered his hands anyway, chakras stilling, shadow clones dissolving one by one across the factory floor. Doesn't mean I've got a better option. Not one that doesn't get those people killed while I'm weighing it. He walked forward, hands raised, toward hunters who'd spent the entire engagement failing to capture him through force and had finally found, in the oldest leverage in any war, the one weakness his compassion couldn't strategize around. Naruto's surrender lasted exactly as long as it took the hostage-holding operator to relax his guard. The moment the man's attention shifted, barking orders to a companion moving to secure Naruto's wrists in binder cuffs, Naruto's hand flashed through a single seal beneath the cover of his own raised arms. A shadow clone, formed silent and instantaneous behind the hostages themselves, seized the factory workers and vanished them in a controlled substitution, replacing them a heartbeat later with 3 more clones who dropped instantly into defensive stances, shielding empty air where captives had stood seconds before. What? The operator's confusion lasted less than a second before Naruto's real body moved, no longer performing surrender, Rasengan already spinning to life in his palm. Told you I didn't have a better option yet, Naruto said, driving the technique into the ground rather than the man himself, a concussive shockwave that threw the operator backward into a support column without killing him. Figured I'd make one. The factory erupted into full engagement again, but the calculus had inverted entirely. Hostages secured safely behind Naruto's clones in a sealed side chamber, every hunter's remaining leverage stripped away in a single decisive move. Ashoka finished her exchange with Sabo Tar moments later, a precise disarming strike that left the Deveronian tracker weaponless and furious, but very much alive, per Windu's earlier request. It was Riza Voss who proved the engagement's final complication, cornering Naruto near the factory's loading bay with a weapon Naruto didn't recognize, something that fired not a blaster bolt but a crackling net of restraint energy designed. He realized half a second too late, specifically to counter enhanced physical capability. The net caught him mid-motion, and Naruto felt something he hadn't experienced since his arrival, his chakra flow, suddenly, violently constricted, Sage Mode's natural energy connection, severed by whatever dampening technology, hummed through the restraint field's crackling lattice. "Kid," Kurama's voice, alarmed, cut through the sudden disorientation. "I know," Naruto thought back, forcing himself to remain calm despite the unfamiliar panic clawing at the edges of his focus. "I know. Working on it." Voss approached with a confident, unhurried step of a professional who'd never once needed to rush a secured target. "Dooku said you'd be resourceful," she said, almost conversational. "Didn't say you'd be foolish enough to reveal your hostage substitution trick to a factory full of witnesses either. Should have saved that surprise, Uzumaki." Naruto, straining against the net's restraint field, managed something that was almost a grin despite the circumstances.
Yeah, well.
Wasn't really planning that far ahead. Mostly just wanted your buddy to let go of some innocent people. "Admirable," Voss said, unimpressed. "Won't save you now, though." It was Ashoka's lightsaber, arriving in a precise arc that severed the net's power conduit before Voss could close the remaining distance, that answered the point instead. The restraint field collapsed, Naruto's chakra flooding back in an overwhelming rush that nearly staggered him with its sudden return, and Voss, recognizing, with the professional pragmatism of someone who'd survived long enough to know when a job had turned unwinnable, retreated rather than press an engagement she'd just lost. The remaining hunters scattered in her wake, Sabo Tar disarmed and detained, the two unidentified operators vanishing into the Undercity's endless shadow before clone reinforcements could secure the factory perimeter. It wasn't a total victory, but it was, Naruto reflected, breathing hard as the last echoes of combat faded and rescued factory workers emerged, shaken but unharmed, from the chamber his clones had protected, close enough. It was in the engagement's chaotic aftermath, however, sorting through captured equipment and interrogating the restrained Sabo Tar, that the true complexity of the night revealed itself. The Deveronian tracker, weighing his diminished options with the calculation of a professional rather than a fanatic, offered information in exchange for leniency, and what he offered reshaped Naruto's entire understanding of who, precisely, he was dealing with. "Wasn't just Dooku's bounty," Tar said, watching Ashoka's restraint cuffs with obvious distaste.
Someone else backed this contract.
"Bigger money than a separatist bounty usually carries. Anonymous client, routed through 3 different brokers to keep it clean. Whoever they are, they wanted you captured worse than Dooku did, and Dooku wanted you badly enough." "Any idea who?" Ashoka pressed. "No," Tar admitted. "That's the honest truth. Whoever's behind it kept themselves invisible even from the people they hired. That's not standard separatist operating procedure. That's someone considerably more careful." Naruto exchanged a glance with Ashoka, the same unspoken question passing between them. If Dooku hadn't been the sole architect behind tonight's ambush, who else in this galaxy possessed both the resources and the motivation to want him captured badly enough to fund a bounty operation independent of, and apparently larger than, the separatist leader's own considerable reach? Master Core, arriving with reinforcements just as the factory's perimeter secured fully, absorbed the intelligence with a grim expression that suggested he shared their unease. "This complicates matters considerably," he said. "If there is a third party orchestrating interest in you beyond the separatists, we are dealing with an unknown variable the Council has not yet accounted for." "Any guesses?" Naruto asked. Kor's silence, and the careful way he avoided meeting Naruto's eyes for a moment too long, suggested he had at least a suspicion he wasn't yet prepared to voice aloud. A suspicion, Naruto would later learn, that pointed toward a figure far more dangerous than Dooku had ever been. Watching this entire unfolding drama unfold from shadows the Jedi Order itself had failed, for years, to fully penetrate. For now, though, exhausted and battered from an engagement that had tested every adaptation he'd managed since his arrival, Naruto allowed himself simply to be grateful for hostages safely returned to their families, for Ashoka's timely lightsaber strike, for Sabo Tar's pragmatic cooperation, for one more night survived in a galaxy that seemed determined to test him at every turn. "Whoever's really behind this," he said quietly, watching the rescued factory workers reunite with worried families at the perimeter's edge, "we'll figure it out. One fight at a time. That's usually how it works, in my experience." Ashoka, standing beside him amid the factory's scorched wreckage, didn't disagree, though the troubled set of her expression suggested she understood, better than she let on, exactly how much larger this particular fight might yet become. Sidious received the report of the failed Coruscant ambush with the same composed patience he applied to every setback, seated alone in his private chambers deep within the Senate spires, the lights of the city stretching endlessly beyond his window, like a web waiting to be pulled taut. Dooku's bounty operation had been, by any reasonable measure, an expensive and public failure. 6 hunters deployed, only 2 returned intact, a factory district's worth of witnesses now able to describe in exquisite detail exactly what the Republic's mysterious new anomaly was capable of when cornered. And yet, Sidious mused, tenting his fingers before him, failure of this particular kind carried its own considerable value. Naruto Uzumaki had revealed, across 2 escalating confrontations, precisely the qualities Sidious found most useful in any variable he intended eventually to weaponize. Raw, prodigious power still finding its ceiling in this galaxy, an instinctive and immovable loyalty to the vulnerable that made him predictable in exactly the ways predictability mattered most, and, crucially, a growing distrust of the very institutions currently sheltering him. The Jedi Council's careful observation. The Senate's political theater. Dooku's failed recruitment, followed immediately by Dooku's attempted capture. Naruto had spent weeks accumulating reasons to trust no faction fully, and reasons, Sidious suspected, were precisely the raw material from which the most useful kind of isolation could be built. It was time, he decided, to introduce a complication considerably more elegant than blunt force. The opportunity arrived 3 weeks later, delivered not through any separatist channel this time, but through the far more insidious avenue of Republic intelligence itself, a fabricated data trail, meticulously constructed across months of patient preparation, suggesting that a separatist bioweapons facility hidden in the Outer Rim's Kessel sector posed an imminent threat to a cluster of neutral worlds entirely unaligned with either side of the war. Innocent systems, civilian populations, exactly the kind of stakes Sidious knew would draw Naruto's attention past any lingering institutional caution. Master Kor brought the intelligence to Naruto and Ashoka in the temple's war room, unaware, as the entire Jedi Order remained unaware, of its true architect. The facility's defenses are formidable, Kor explained, projecting a holographic schematic that had taken Sidious's agents considerable effort to render convincingly authentic. Too formidable for a standard extraction team, without significant casualties. But your particular capabilities, Naruto, could accomplish what an entire battalion might otherwise struggle to achieve without triggering the facility's fail-safes. Many civilians at risk if we don't move? Naruto asked, already leaning forward, the specific gravity that entered his posture whenever innocent lives hung in the balance settling over him like a second skin. Estimates suggest 4 neutral worlds within contamination range, should the facility's stores be weaponized and deployed, Kor said. Approximately 2 million civilians, conservatively. Naruto didn't hesitate. Then we move. When do we leave? It was Ashoka, watching the schematic with a faint, nagging unease she couldn't yet articulate, who voiced the first note of caution. This intelligence came through unusually fast channels, she said. Faster than our normal verification process typically allows. Something about the timeline feels convenient. Core finished, frowning at the observation himself now that it had been named aloud. You're not wrong to flag it. I'll request additional verification before 2 million people, Master Core. Naruto interrupted, not unkindly, but with the particular urgency of someone who'd learned, painfully, exactly what happened when hesitation cost innocent lives. How long does verification take? Hours? Days? I've seen what happens when people wait too long to act because the timeline felt inconvenient. It was, Sidious would later reflect with the satisfaction of a plan unfolding exactly as architected, the precise vulnerability he'd calculated Naruto would present, a hero's urgency, weaponized against his own better judgment, against the very institutional caution that might otherwise have exposed the trap before it sprung. The mission proceeded within 18 hours, a small strike team built around Naruto, Ashoka, and a clone special operations squad, launching toward Kessel sector coordinates that led, upon arrival, not to any bioweapons facility at all, but to an elaborate ambush constructed with meticulous care across the abandoned husk of a mining colony rigged from foundation to spire, with force suppression technology. Experimental, expensive, and entirely unprecedented in Naruto's experience of this galaxy. The trap sprang the moment the strike team crossed the colony's outer perimeter. Suppression fields activated across the entire structure, and Naruto felt, with mounting horror, his chakra flow constrict in a manner far more severe and far more total than Riza Voss's restraint net had ever managed. Not merely dampened, but smothered, Kurama's presence receding to a faint, distant murmur at the very edge of perception. Something's wrong, the fox managed, voice already fading. Asterisk, this isn't like before. This is, asterisk. The connection cut entirely, and for the first time since his arrival in this galaxy, Naruto found himself utterly, terrifyingly alone in his own mind. Ashoka, he called, chakra reserves suddenly feeling thin and unfamiliar, every enhanced sense that had carried him through weeks of escalating conflict abruptly muted to something closer to ordinary human limitation. I feel it too, Ashoka called back, her own connection to the force noticeably strained, lightsaber igniting with visible effort rather than its usual effortless grace. This facility isn't separatist bioweapons research. This is a trap built specifically for. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Sidious's voice, calm and pleasant and utterly without hesitation, resolved through the colony's ancient comm system, filling every corridor with quiet, measured menace. Welcome, Naruto Uzumaki, the voice said. I confess, I've been curious to meet you properly for some time now. Count Dooku's approach, I always suspected, was rather too generous for someone of your particular disposition. I find directness tends to yield more instructive results. Who are you? Naruto demanded, already moving through the suppression field's disorienting fog toward the source of the transmission, every instinct screaming that whoever this was represented a danger considerably beyond anything Dooku had managed to muster. A question you'll have ample opportunity to answer for yourself in time, Sidious said. For now, I merely wish to demonstrate something important, that the power you've grown accustomed to relying upon in this galaxy is not, in fact, inexhaustible. Nor is it, I suspect, entirely yours to command whenever you please. How does it feel, Naruto Uzumaki, to discover limits you did not know you possessed? It felt, Naruto realized, exactly like every moment of his childhood before he'd learned to master the fox's power at all, vulnerable, uncertain, stripped of the strength he'd spent a lifetime earning. The old fear surfaced faster than he expected, sharp and cold, before something harder and more familiar rose to meet it, the same stubborn refusal to be defined by his weaknesses that had carried him through every crisis before this one. Funny thing about limits, Naruto called back, forcing steadiness into his voice despite the suppression field's disorienting pressure. I've hit plenty before. Every time, I found a way through anyway. Gonna be real disappointing for you, if this turns out the same. Sidious's soft, Unhurried laughter echoed through the colony's dead corridors. We shall see, won't we? Consider this merely our introduction. I look forward to discovering precisely what remains of you once every advantage you've relied upon in this galaxy has been systematically removed. The transmission cut, and the colony's hidden defenses, battle droids, security turrets, and something considerably more dangerous stirring in the structure's deepest chamber, began, with mechanical inevitability, to converge on Naruto and Ashoka's stranded position. Ashoka's lightsaber flickered, drawing on reserves of the force that felt, even to her own trained senses, thinner and less reliable than she'd ever experienced. Whatever's coming, she said grimly, we're facing it without our full strength. Naruto rolled his shoulders, forcing down the lingering echo of old fear, reaching instead for something that had never depended on Kurama's power in the first place, the same stubborn, unbreakable will that had carried him from despised outcast to Hokage, long before he'd ever learned to fully master the fox at all. Then we fight with what we've got, he said, dropping into a ready stance as the first wave of droids rounded the corridor ahead. Wouldn't be the first time I've had to prove strength was never just about how much power I could throw around. Somewhere in the colony's shadowed depths, patient and unseen, Darth Sidious watched the opening skirmish unfold through a network of hidden sensors, already calculating the next phase of a trap whose true purpose Naruto Uzumaki had not yet begun to comprehend. The mining colony's corridors became a gauntlet, and Naruto discovered, within the first 10 minutes of combat, exactly how much he'd come to rely on abilities he'd never had to consciously think about before this moment. No shadow clones. The technique required a baseline chakra, reserve the suppression field kept perpetually just out of reach, every attempt collapsing before the seal could fully form. No sage mode, no natural energy to draw upon in a structure engineered specifically to sever that connection. What remained was simply Naruto himself, trained taijutsu, hard-won combat instinct, and a stubbornness that had outlasted worse odds than a single suppression field and an army of battle droids. On your left, Ashoka called, her lightsaber cutting through a droid's chassis with visibly more effort than the weapon should have required, the suppression field dragging at her force-enhanced reflexes like wading through deep water. Naruto pivoted, driving a bone-jarring kick into an advancing droid's midsection hard enough to fold the chassis in half, following through with a strike that crushed its photoreceptor before it could recalibrate. No jutsu behind the blow, pure physical conditioning, honed across years of training that had never once depended on Kurama's power to begin with. Careful, he called back, breathing hard. These things came prepared. They advanced in stages, clearing corridor after corridor of the colony's automated defenses, taking hits neither of them would have absorbed at full strength, trading efficiency for sheer bloody-minded persistence. It was, Naruto reflected grimly between exchanges, uncomfortably reminiscent of his earliest years as a genin, outmatched, under-resourced, surviving on will alone because the alternative was giving up entirely. The suppression field's true purpose revealed itself an hour into the engagement, when the colony's deepest chamber disgorged something considerably more dangerous than battle droids, a containment unit, ancient and modified with technology Naruto didn't recognize, releasing a creature that had clearly been engineered, or captured and augmented, specifically to counter force-sensitive combatants. Something reptilian and vast, its hide crackling with the same suppression energy saturating the colony, moving with a predatory intelligence that suggested this was no mindless beast. A force-null hybrid, Ashoka breathed, backing away instinctively. I've heard rumors the Separatists were experimenting with creatures resistant to Jedi combat techniques. I didn't think they'd actually pull it off, Naruto finished grimly.
Yeah.
Guess today's full of surprises. The creature moved faster than its size suggested, and the ensuing engagement pushed both of them to genuine desperation. Ashoka's lightsaber strikes glancing off hide, too dense to cut cleanly, Naruto's physical strikes absorbed by muscle mass that simply didn't register conventional damage the way droid chassis had. It was, Naruto realized with mounting alarm as a swipe of the creature's claws sent him skidding across the chamber floor, an engagement neither of them could win through attrition. They were losing ground, losing stamina, losing the fight in slow, inevitable increments. This isn't working, he thought, forcing himself upright despite the ringing pain in his ribs, watching Ashoka barely dodge a follow-up strike that would have ended the fight outright. Need another way. Need, asterisk. And then, faint and distant but unmistakably present, he felt it, a flicker of warmth at the very edge of his consciousness, Kurama's presence pushing back against the suppression field, smothering weight with the sheer, stubborn force of a bond forged through years of genuine partnership rather than mere technological coincidence. Kid, the fox's voice came through, strained but present, asterisk, this field's strong, but it's built to suppress a connection to external power. Ours isn't external anymore. Hasn't been for years. We're not two things anymore, Naruto. We're one. Maybe that's the crack in their armor, asterisk. Naruto understood instantly, memory surfacing of every hard lesson that had built towards Six Paths Sage Mode in the first place. Not borrowed power, not external force channeled from elsewhere, but a fusion so complete it transcended the very categories a suppression field was built to sever. Let's find out, he thought, and reached inward with everything he had left. The suppression field fought him every step of the way, and for a terrifying moment Naruto felt nothing shift at all, chakra reserves remaining stubbornly, painfully thin. But he pushed past it anyway, past exhaustion and pain and the field's smothering pressure, reaching for the deepest well of connection he possessed, not the fox's power alone, not his own chakra alone, but the fused, singular truth of what 6 years of partnership had actually built between them. Golden light erupted through the chamber, Six Paths Sage Mode blooming to life around him in a corona of orange and black markings, natural energy and tailed beast chakra fusing into something the suppression field, calibrated for conventional force sensitivity and conventional external power channeling, simply had no framework to smother. By the force, Ashoka breathed, staring as Naruto rose to his feet, power radiating off him in waves that visibly bent the chamber's ambient light. Yeah, Naruto said, voice carrying a resonance it hadn't held moments before, 6 years of hard-won mastery settling into every word. Figured it was about time I stopped fighting with one hand tied behind my back. What followed was, by any measure, the most decisive display of power Naruto had unleashed since his arrival in this galaxy. Truth-seeking orbs materialized around him, spheres of condensed power capable of nullifying nearly any technique they touched, and he moved through the remainder of the engagement with a speed and precision that transformed the fight from desperate survival into controlled, purposeful conclusion. The Force Null creature, formidable against conventional combat, found itself facing something that operated entirely outside its engineered countermeasures, chakra fused so completely with will and partnership that no suppression technology built for this galaxy's force could fully contain it. He subdued the creature rather than killed it, a final orb driving it into unconsciousness with careful, deliberate restraint even at the height of his unleashed power, a choice Ashoka would later note, with quiet admiration, that few beings wielding that much strength in a single moment would have thought to make. The battle droids fell in swift, efficient succession after that, Naruto's Six Paths abilities clearing the colony's remaining defenses with a thoroughness that left no doubt, to anyone monitoring the engagement, exactly what he was truly capable of when pushed past every limitation this galaxy had attempted to impose. Sidious, watching the engagement's final moments through his network of hidden sensors, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile despite the trap's failure to capture or break its intended target. Even more interesting than I calculated, he thought, already recalculating the shape of every future plan this new variable would need to be woven into. Asterisk power that transcends the Force's own limitations, bonded through partnership rather than mere technique. A pity such potential remains so stubbornly, predictably devoted to protecting the weak. Such devotion, in time, tends to prove its own most exploitable weakness. Asterisk. He withdrew his sensors before the colony's remaining structural integrity gave way entirely, Naruto's final truth-seeking orb detonation bringing down the facility's deepest chambers in a controlled collapse that buried whatever remaining evidence might have traced the trap back to its true architect. In the aftermath, Standing amid the ruins of a colony that had never held any bioweapons at all, Naruto powered down from Six Paths Sage mode with visible exhaustion, the technique's cost finally catching up with him now that the immediate danger had passed. Kurama's presence settled back into its familiar warm rhythm at the edge of his consciousness, whole and present once more. That wasn't a separatist facility, Ashoka said quietly, surveying the wreckage, the earlier unease she'd voiced before the mission now fully, grimly confirmed. The intelligence was fabricated. Someone wanted us here, specifically. Yeah, Naruto agreed, breathing hard, watching the colony's ruins settle into silence. Whoever's voice that wasn't Dooku. Different feel to it entirely. Colder, more patient. He shook his head slowly. Feels like Dooku was never really the biggest threat in this galaxy. Feels like we just met whoever actually is. Ashoka said nothing, but her expression, troubled and thoughtful in the ruined chamber's dim emergency lighting, suggested she'd already begun to suspect the same unsettling truth Naruto had just voiced aloud, one that would, in the days ahead, force the entire Jedi Council to reckon with a threat far more dangerous than any single separatist leader had ever represented. The Jedi Council convened in emergency session within hours of the strike team's return, and for the first time since his arrival in the galaxy, Naruto found himself not merely observed by the assembled masters, but genuinely consulted, his account of the colony's suppression field, the Force Null creature, and above all, the cold, patient voice that had orchestrated the entire trap, treated with a gravity that marked a clear shift in how the Council regarded him. A suppression field of that sophistication, Master Windu said, studying the recovered technical fragments Ashoka's team had salvaged from the colony's ruins before its collapse, combined with genetic experimentation on Force Null hybrids. This exceeds anything we've previously attributed to separatist research capability. Dooku is skilled, but this bears the signature of considerably more resources and considerably more patience than even he typically demonstrates. The voice wasn't Dooku's, Naruto confirmed again, the memory still unsettling him more than he wanted to admit. I've heard Dooku talk. This was different. Calmer. Like he already knew exactly how the whole thing would end before it even started, like watching us fight for our lives was just data collection for him. Didn't even seem angry the trap failed. Just curious what he'd learned instead. Master Yoda's expression, throughout the briefing, had grown increasingly troubled, his ancient eyes distant with a suspicion he seemed reluctant to voice fully even now. A shadow, long have I sensed, moving behind this war's every turn, he said finally, quiet enough that the chamber stilled to hear him. Never revealing itself. Never claiming credit. Patient beyond even Dooku's considerable patience. Wondered, I have, for some time, whether a single hand truly guides both sides of this conflict towards some purpose neither Republic nor Separatist fully understands. The suggestion landed heavily across the assembled council, several masters exchanging glances that carried the particular weight of a fear long suspected but never before spoken aloud in open session. You believe there's a Sith Lord operating beyond Dooku, Windu said slowly. Someone Dooku himself answers to. Suspected I have, Yoda admitted. Confirmed, this encounter with Naruto and Padawan Vrai may finally have. If true, and I fear it may well be, then a threat we face, far greater than any separatist army. A Sith hand guiding this entire war from shadows we have failed, for years, to fully penetrate. Naruto felt the weight of that realization settle over the chamber like a physical thing, and found himself, unexpectedly, at the center of a council conversation that had shifted from wary observation of an unknown variable toward genuine strategic partnership against a threat that apparently exceeded even the Jedi's own considerable awareness. Whoever this is, Naruto said into the heavy silence, he already told me himself, basically. Said this was just an introduction. That he wanted to see what I was really capable of once you stripped away every advantage. He looked around the chamber, meeting each master's eyes in turn. That's not someone testing a threat to eliminate. That's someone testing a tool he's still deciding whether to use. I've seen that particular look before from people back home who wanted exactly the same thing from me. Then he intends to attempt what Dooku already failed to achieve, Kor said grimly. Recruitment. Or, failing that, control through more forceful means. Or worse, Ashoka added quietly. If he's patient enough to orchestrate something this elaborate just to gather information, he's patient enough to keep trying until something works. The council's deliberation extended late into the night. Strategic discussions Naruto found himself included in with a thoroughness that would have seemed impossible during his first uncertain weeks in this galaxy. It was during this extended session, however, that a fracture began to emerge, not between Naruto and the Jedi, but within the council's own ranks, over precisely how to respond to a threat whose true identity remained maddeningly obscured. We should petition the Senate for expanded authority to investigate, Master Ordvantis argued, a normally reserved council member whose urgency now carried real conviction. A hidden Sith Lord operating at this level of sophistication represents an existential threat that demands resources beyond what the Order alone can marshal, and risk exposing our suspicions before we have concrete evidence. Windu countered. If this Sith Lord truly operates from a position of political influence, as Master Yoda's suspicions suggest, alerting the Senate prematurely may only warn our adversary that we've begun to suspect his existence at all. The debate stretched on, competing strategic philosophies clashing without clear resolution, and Naruto, watching the council's genuine, unresolved disagreement unfold in real time, found himself, for the first time, offering something other than his own moral conviction. He offered, instead, a piece of hard-won tactical wisdom from a lifetime spent fighting enemies who preferred shadows to open confrontation. Back home, he said, quiet enough that the chamber gradually stilled to listen. We fought someone like this once. Guy who spent years manipulating both sides of a conflict from behind the scenes, letting everyone else exhaust themselves while he waited for the perfect moment to reveal his hand. He paused, remembering. Problem is, the more you chase shadows trying to expose him early, the more warning you give him to adapt. What actually worked wasn't chasing him directly. It was getting strong enough, together, that when he finally did reveal himself, we weren't scrambling to catch up. We were already ready. Windu studied him with an expression that had, gradually and almost imperceptibly across the preceding weeks, shifted from wary skepticism towards something closer to genuine respect. You're suggesting patience, preparation, rather than pursuit. I'm suggesting you don't have to choose between doing nothing and doing something reckless, Naruto said. Strengthen what you can control. Build trust between the people who need to fight this together, when it comes. And when he finally does show his hand, 'cause guys like this always do, eventually, once they think they've won, you're not caught flat-footed. Master Yoda's ancient eyes settled on Naruto for a long, considering moment, something that might have been the first genuine flicker of full trust crossing his weathered features. Wisdom in that, there is, he said finally. Earned wisdom, forged through hard experience rather than doctrine alone. Value in that, this council would do well to recognize, rather than dismiss simply for its unfamiliar origin. The session concluded without full resolution. The council remained divided on precisely how to proceed against a threat that had, for the first time, been named aloud within Jedi Temple walls if not yet identified by name. But something had shifted irrevocably in how Naruto was regarded within those walls, the wary observation of the early weeks giving way, gradually and against considerable institutional inertia, towards something that increasingly resembled genuine alliance. Later that night, standing once more on the garden terrace, where his earlier conversation with Master Kor had first cracked open questions of attachment and doctrine, Naruto found Ashoka joining him, her own expression heavy with the weight of everything the day's revelations had unveiled. Feels like the real fight hasn't even started yet, she said quietly, watching Coruscant's endless lights stretch toward every horizon. Yeah, Naruto agreed. Feels that way to me too. He was quiet for a moment, considering. But we're not facing it alone anymore. Not the way I was those first few weeks, wondering if anyone here would ever really trust me. He glanced at her, something warm and genuine breaking through the day's heavier weight. Guess that's something, even before the real fight starts. Ashoka smiled, faint but real, and neither of them noticed, nor could they have possibly known, that far across the galaxy, in a chamber even the most paranoid Jedi surveillance had never once penetrated, Darth Sidious had already begun drafting the next, considerably more personal phase of a plan whose true target had never been the Republic or the Separatists at all, but the singular, unprecedented power standing on that terrace, still believing he had time left to prepare. The final confrontation arrived not through Sidious's careful orchestration, but through Naruto's own choice, a decision that would come to define, more than any single battle before it, exactly what kind of legend this galaxy would eventually remember him as. It began with a message, 3 weeks after the colony's collapse, delivered this time not to Naruto directly, but to Ashoka, routed through channels that bypassed even the temple's most sophisticated security with the same casual ease Sidious had demonstrated before. The message contained coordinates, a timestamp, and a single line that made Ashoka's blood run cold the moment she read it aloud to the assembled council. Bring your friend to these coordinates within 48 hours, or I will simply come to Coruscant myself and collect him at considerably greater cost to the city around him. He's done posturing, Winda said grimly, studying the message's authentication signature, which traced, maddeningly, to nowhere conclusive. This is an ultimatum. Then we don't go, Kor said immediately. We fortify the temple, request Senate security reinforcement, and force him to come to us on ground we control. And risk him following through on threatening the entire city instead? Ashoka countered. 3 million people live within a reasonable blast radius of the temple district alone. We can't gamble civilian lives on the hope he's bluffing. Naruto, who had remained quiet throughout the council's escalating debate, finally spoke, and the chamber stilled to listen with a respect that would have seemed impossible mere weeks earlier. I'm going, he said simply. Not 'cause the message told me to. Because staying here and hoping he doesn't follow through on that threat isn't a plan. It's just fear dressed up as caution. I've spent this whole galaxy so far reacting to what other people decided about me. Dooku's offer, the Senate's hearing, bounty hunters, even that colony trap, all of it, other people setting the terms and me responding after the fact. He met each council member's eyes in turn. This time, I choose the terms. I go to him on my own decision, not because he ordered it, and I make sure whatever happens next, it happens because I chose it, not because I was cornered into it. You'd be walking into whatever trap he's prepared without any certainty of what awaits you, Winda said, though the objection carried less conviction than his earlier arguments typically held. Probably, Naruto agreed. But I've walked into worse without knowing the odds and come out the other side. What I won't do is let 3 million people become leverage in a fight that's supposed to be between him and me. He paused, softer now. I'd like backup, though. If you're willing. Not 'cause I need saving, because I've learned, since I got here, that fighting alongside people you trust makes you stronger than fighting alone ever did. That's not weakness. That's the whole thing I've been trying to explain to you all along. It was Master Yoda who finally broke the council's remaining hesitation, his ancient voice carrying quiet, absolute conviction. Alone, he need not go. Chosen his path, he has. With wisdom this council would do well to honor rather than obstruct. Support him, we shall. Not as observers managing an unknown variable, but as allies standing beside one we have, at great cost and greater patience, finally learned to trust. The coordinates led to an abandoned separatist listening post on the fringes of the Coruscant system, isolated enough to limit civilian risk, exactly the kind of controlled environment Sidious favored for demonstrations of power. Naruto arrived accompanied by Ashoka, Master Kor, and a contingent of clone special forces. Not the overwhelming force the council might once have preferred, but a deliberately measured response calibrated to Naruto's own insistence that this remained, fundamentally, a confrontation he needed to face on his own terms rather than through simple, overwhelming numbers. Sidious waited for them within the station's central chamber, no longer hiding behind holographic transmission or distant manipulation, revealed at last in the flesh, an elderly, unassuming figure whose true nature betrayed itself only in the cold, ancient weight radiating through the force around him, a presence that made even Ashoka's battle-hardened composure falter momentarily. "You came," Sidious observed, something almost like satisfaction coloring his measured tone. "And brought allies, I see. A curious choice, given how thoroughly I demonstrated your vulnerability when isolated from them." "Funny thing," Naruto said, stepping forward, chakra settling steady and controlled beneath his skin. "You keep thinking isolating me is the winning move. Keep forgetting that every time I've had people beside me, I've found a way through worse than anything you've thrown at me solo." "We shall see," Sidious said, and the chamber's ambient light dimmed as dark energy gathered, crackling, around his outstretched hands. "Consider this the final examination, Naruto Uzumaki. Show me precisely what you are, unburdened by restraint." The battle that followed tested every ounce of growth Naruto had accumulated across his weeks in this galaxy, not merely raw power, though Six Paths Sage Mode blazed to life within moments of the engagement's opening exchange, but the accumulated wisdom of every conversation, every choice, every hard-won trust built brick by careful brick since his arrival. Sidious fought with a mastery of the dark side that dwarfed anything Naruto had witnessed from Dooku, force lightning arcing in devastating cascades that Naruto met with truth-seeking orbs deployed with precision earned through genuine partnership rather than raw instinct alone. It was Ashoka and Core, fighting alongside him rather than watching from a careful distance, who tipped the engagement's balance in ways Naruto alone could never have managed. Core's decades of tactical experience anticipating Sidious's positioning, Ashoka's lightsaber work covering angles Naruto's own attention couldn't fully track amid the chaos. Sidious, accustomed to isolating and overwhelming singular targets, found himself instead facing something his careful calculations hadn't fully accounted for: genuine, coordinated alliance, built on trust rather than mere tactical convenience. "Interesting," Sidious said, breathing harder now, the first genuine strain entering his composed expression as the engagement stretched past the swift, decisive conclusion he'd clearly anticipated. "You've made this galaxy's flawed institutions genuinely believe in you. A remarkable achievement, however ultimately futile." "Wasn't trying to achieve anything," Naruto said, driving a final, decisive Rasengan, enhanced by Six Paths chakra into something considerably more devastating, through the last of Sidious's defensive force barriers. "Just tried being honest with people and letting them decide for themselves whether that honesty was worth trusting. Turns out most people, given a real choice, choose better than you're betting on." The final exchange left Sidious battered, defenses shattered, forced into a tactical retreat rather than the decisive victory or capture he'd so carefully orchestrated this entire confrontation to achieve. He vanished into a prepared escape vessel before Core's forces could fully secure the station, leaving behind only the lingering, unsettling knowledge that whoever he truly was, whatever position of influence he held within the galaxy's political architecture, he remained, for now, beyond the Republic's reach. "He'll be back," Ashoka said afterward, surveying the station's wreckage, exhaustion mixing with grim satisfaction. "Someone like that doesn't simply give up after one setback." "No," Naruto agreed, powering down from Six Paths Sage Mode, Kurama's presence settling warm and steady once more beneath his skin. "He won't. But next time, this galaxy's a little more ready than it was today. That matters." "That's not nothing." Master Core studied Naruto for a long, considering moment, something that might have been genuine pride entering his weathered expression. "You could have refused this confrontation entirely. Remained within the temple's protection, let the council manage the threat through institutional channels." "Could have," Naruto agreed. "But that's not really who I am. Never has been. I fight for the people I care about on my own terms, whenever the fight actually matters. Took this whole galaxy a while to understand that about me. Think maybe I finally proved it today, though." The journey back to Coruscant passed in comfortable, exhausted silence, and it was there, standing once more on the temple's garden terrace beneath the city's endless artificial glow, that Naruto found himself reflecting on everything the preceding weeks had built. Trust earned rather than assumed, alliances forged through genuine choice rather than institutional obligation, a philosophy of connection and compassion that had, against considerable doctrinal resistance, begun reshaping how even the Jedi Council itself approached questions of attachment and strength.
He was not Jedi.
He would never fully embrace their doctrine of detachment, however much respect he'd come to hold for individual Jedi like Kor and Ashoka. He was not separatist, had refused Dooku's offer without hesitation despite understanding, better than most, the legitimate grievances underlying the Count's rebellion. He belonged, in the end, to neither faction fully, something else entirely, forging a third path built on principles he'd carried with him across the impossible distance between galaxies. That strength and compassion were never opposites, that trust had to be earned rather than assumed, that no one, however broken by circumstance, was entirely beyond the possibility of redemption. "What happens now?" Ashoka asked, joining him at the terrace's edge, watching Coruscant's endless traffic streams weave their familiar patterns across the darkening sky.
Now.
Naruto considered the question, feeling Kurama's steady warmth beneath his skin, feeling the accumulated weight of weeks that had tested him more thoroughly than he'd expected any single galaxy could manage. "Now I keep doing what I've been doing.
Protect the people I can.
Trust the people who've earned it. Face whatever comes next, one choice at a time." He smiled, genuine and tired and hopeful all at once. Same as always, really. Just a different sky to do it under. The weeks that followed Naruto's confrontation with Sidious reshaped the Jedi Order's understanding of itself in ways few among the Council could have anticipated when a stranger first fell from a tear in the sky above Christophsis. The threat of a hidden Sith Lord operating within the galaxy's political architecture remained unresolved, a shadow still gathering strength somewhere beyond the Republic's reach, patient enough to wait for a better moment. But the galaxy that awaited his eventual return was, in small and significant ways, no longer the same galaxy he had tested that day on the listening post. Master Windu, who had spent Naruto's early weeks as his most consistent skeptic, found himself, in the months that followed, quietly revising portions of his own understanding of attachment's relationship to strength, not abandoning the code that had shaped his entire life, but questioning, for the first time in decades, whether its rigid application served wisdom as faithfully as he'd once assumed. He never fully embraced Naruto's philosophy, but he stopped dismissing it outright, and among the Jedi Order, that shift alone carried the weight of genuine transformation. Master Kor, whose willingness to vouch for an unknown quantity had first opened the door to everything that followed, became something closer to mentor than observer, not teaching Naruto the Jedi way precisely, but learning alongside him, two warriors from impossibly different traditions discovering, gradually, how much genuine wisdom could be built in the space between doctrines rather than strictly within either one. Ashoka Vrai's own journey proved, perhaps the most quietly profound of all. The careful Jedi neutrality she'd worn like armor during their first encounter on Christophsis had, across months of genuine partnership, given way to something the Jedi Code rarely acknowledged by name but Naruto recognized instantly for exactly what it was. Real friendship, built on trust rather than institutional obligation, the kind that had carried him through every crisis of his own life back home. She would carry that lesson forward long after this particular chapter of the war concluded, in ways that would shape choices still waiting for her further down an uncertain road. The clone troopers who had first regarded Naruto with wary distance came, gradually, to consider him something closer to one of their own, not because he shared their genetic template or their military discipline, but because he'd been, from his very first conversation with Fixer in a quiet mess hall, one of the only beings in the galaxy who'd looked past their function to see the individuals underneath. That small kindness rippled outward in ways Naruto himself would never fully witness, planting seeds of self-recognition among soldiers built, quite literally, to believe they existed for nothing beyond obedience. Count Dooku, for his part, withdrew his direct interest in recruiting or capturing Naruto following the colony's failed trap, not from any change of heart, but from the cold, pragmatic recognition that Sidious's shadow now loomed over whatever plans he might have entertained regarding the anomaly from beyond the stars. He would watch Naruto's continued presence in the war with careful, distant interest, wondering, perhaps, whether his own initial assessment, an equal, not a weapon, might yet prove true under circumstances he no longer fully controlled. And Naruto himself, standing now at the center of a galaxy that had tested his every conviction and found, again and again, that his philosophy held true even beneath impossibly foreign skies, understood something he hadn't fully grasped upon his arrival, that the ninja way he'd carried across an impossible dimensional divide wasn't merely a personal creed. It was proof, offered freely to anyone willing to witness it, that connection mattered more than doctrine, that compassion was never truly weakness, that redemption remained possible for even the most broken souls the galaxy could offer, Dooku included, however unlikely that possibility currently seemed. He had not chosen the Jedi. He had not chosen the Separatists. He belonged, in the end, to something he'd built entirely on his own terms, a network of trust spanning clone troopers and Jedi masters, a Padawan who'd become genuine friend, an uneasy respect even from figures like Windu who'd once considered him nothing but calculated risk. It was not the found family he'd built back home, could never fully replace what waited for him across a divide he still didn't fully understand how to cross. But it was real, and it was his, forged through choice rather than circumstance, exactly the way he'd always believed the strongest bonds should be built. The greater threat still waited, patient and unseen, somewhere in the galaxy's political shadows, a reckoning deferred rather than resolved, promising confrontations still to come that would test everything Naruto had built here even more thoroughly than anything he'd faced so far. But he faced that uncertain future the same way he'd faced every crisis before it, not with certainty of victory, but with unshakable conviction in the principles that had carried him through impossible odds his entire life. Whatever came next, whatever shadow finally revealed its full shape, whatever choices still waited to test the alliances he'd built brick by careful brick, Naruto Uzumaki would meet it the same way he'd met every challenge since falling from a tear in an unfamiliar sky, standing beside the people he'd chosen to trust, fighting for a galaxy that had slowly, against considerable odds, learned to trust him back. The stars above Coruscant burned on, indifferent to the quiet revolution one stranger's arrival had set in motion. But somewhere in the Jedi Temple's ancient halls, a new understanding had taken root, fragile, contested, but genuine, that strength and compassion had never truly been opposites at all.